So thank you, chairpersons, and thank you again to the organizers for such a nice conference and for the great hospitality. I'm going to speak on MRI of the neonatal brain, and this is a topic of my interest both clinically and research-wise. And I have the privilege of working with a fantastic team, and I must say that we have considerable experience in this area. So before I begin, I want to show you some slides. In 1994, that was the first time I saw MRI of the brain in a very, very young child. And I made a mistake, and that's a mistake I don't want anybody to repeat again. So I'm showing you two slides. These are the first two slides, and these two slides. Which one do you think is normal, and which one do you think is abnormal? It's a trick question. Don't answer it. We'll come to this later. But just think about it, how these look different. This is a T1 image, this is T1 image, this is T2, and this is T2. So our objectives for this talk will be to look at causes of encephalopathy, which is a very common cause why we image the neonatal brain. How do we optimize MR technique because the neonatal brain is so small and has a different appearance. And to be familiar with some normal appearances of the brain in terms of development of the white matter and myelination, and how to diagnose abnormalities of the neonatal MR. So this is a how-to talk. So first of all, encephalopathy in a newborn. Everybody knows that hypoxic ischemic injury during the birth process is a very, very significant cause and a common cause of encephalopathy in the neonatal brain. It is, I would say, about 85 to 90% of the time when you have encephalopathy in a neonate immediately after birth, this is the cause. Then, of course, we have to remember the differential diagnosis, infectious diseases, metabolic disorders which are pretty rare but can occur, trauma to the brain, and certain congenital disorders when present with encephalopathy. Note that we often say hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, but that is a clinical term which includes multi-organ dysfunction, profound acidosis, and other things. Now we use it loosely to just indicate hypoxic ischemic injury. But if you just want to use a very strict term for a radiologist, it's better to use hypoxic ischemic injury because we don't know what is happening to the rest of the body. A neonatologist or a clinician will probably know what's happening to the rest of the body. Another important fact is that the preterm child is at great risk for hypoxic ischemic injury and for hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. So remember that connection. Now before you even start thinking about doing an MRI of the brain, and yesterday Tony was telling us how important it is to clinically correlate, and I'll stress on that again in the next 2 to 3 slides. When I look at an MR of the neonatal brain, I'm blind unless I know a detailed clinical story. I need to know exact age at birth when you suspect an injury, because look at this. This is a preterm injury which is more periventricular white matter, whereas if you have a term injury, then it is more involving the peripheral cortex, the occipital gray matter, or the deep gray matter nuclei. So the pattern of injury is totally different. Then try to time your insult. And the reason why we want to time it is because diffusion method imaging is so important that if you think that fetal distress occurred about a week or 2 weeks before birth, you may not see anything at diffusion. The diffusion pattern has resolved by 5 to 7 days and has normalized. So very important to time the insult and your MR. Now this thing is very important. Number 3, sorry I called it number 2 over here. If you have a newborn who was born, appears to be normal, but after 5 hours, 7 hours, or 1 or 2 days starts having encephalopathy, then the differential diagnosis totally changes. Hypoxic ischemic injury occurs at birth, immediately at birth, or within a few minutes, or 15, 20 minutes is obvious to you. Whereas if it is due to infectious or metabolic causes, particularly metabolic causes, then it occurs a few hours to a few days later. For example, look at this 2 diffusion images. You can see diffusion restriction in the posterior white matter and the posterior brainstem, and the internal capsule and the thalami. And this is a classic pattern for a metabolic disease called Maple syrup urine disease. And this pattern is something which even a resident should be able to diagnose, because if you treat this patient or this neonate soon enough, you can actually reverse some of the damage that may occur to the brain. Now the other thing is, because the MR of the brain in the neonate is challenging to diagnose, I like to know the history more in detail about Apgars, about hypoglycemia, because it can cause a specific pattern of damage in the term infant, like in the occipital lobes over here. And other things which could change the appearance of the brain. Acute kernicterus can cause increased T1 signal. Then I also like to know about treatment given. For example, phenobarbital. Seizures are a very common presentation for neonatal encephalopathy. And when you load the child with phenobarbital, which neonatologists often do, it causes a peak very close to the lactate peak and can mimic lactate. So you should know that and not mistake that lactate, that phenobarb peak for something abnormal. Previously, in our hospital, they used to give a lot of manganese in total parenteral nutrition, and that used to cause an abnormal signal in the deep nuclear. This new thing that is hypothermia, which is now becoming standard of treatment in all NICUs across the world, is something that you should know because it decreases the diffusion restriction that you expect to see from insult. So you can see this is a patient where due to manganese or connectors, which will have increased T1 signal within the globus pallidus. This is a patient who was loaded with phenobarb, had hypoxic ischemic injury, and you can see lactate which occurs at 1.3 ppm on MR spectroscopy. This is a preservative for phenobarbital, propane 1,2-diol. Now if you didn't have the lactate, you would think that this is lactate and you would mistake this for an abnormal insult to the brain. And hypothermia, remember that. I'm pretty sure that in the NICUs in Kuwait also, they must be treating kids with hypoxic ischemic injury with hypothermia. And there is more and more literature coming out that it does protect the brain, and it also causes a different appearance of the brain for a given amount of insult that you would expect in terms of diffusion-weighted imaging and diffusion restriction. So that was about the clinical history, which is extremely important for us to get before we go on to start doing an MR. Now, before you start putting the baby on the table, you need to make sure that you optimize transport. Remember, these kids are extremely sick and they are unstable. You have to use the optimal coils because, remember, we have a 22 centimeter size head, so we use a bigger head coil. Neonates have a very small head coil, and obviously the signal to noise ratio will be different. And then you need to optimize the sequences because the water content of the neonatal brain is much higher than the water content of an older child. Now what we do is we work very closely with our neonatologists and the neonatal transport team. We make sure that the baby never comes to the MR and wait because of safety reasons, because you don't want the neonate to crash in the radiology department. And we have a nursing team, a neonatal transport team, which thinks of all these things stable. This is what actually one of the nurses told me: sugar, temperature, artificial breathing, blood pressure, labs. And don't forget the parents, because when they see their newborn child with all these tubes and all this management, they're emotionally very upset. So emotional support for the parents is one of the other big things that they do whenever they take a child for any investigation. So you have to think about all these things. Another thing that I've seen radiologists often make a mistake is they put on the saturation pulse monitors, pulse oximeters on the neonate, and some of these babies are so sick that they cannot saturate more than 90, 92 or 94. And for that, as an older child or an adult, that will be a critical level, and you stop that scan, you sometimes call a code and you send the neonate back. But in these children, some of these children, it could be a normal finding. That's why that close communication with the NICU is critical. Absolutely critical. And how do we keep the neonate quiet and safe? Sometimes we use chloral hydrate. Many times we have a vacuum cushion where when you pull out the air, it sort of envelopes the baby and keeps them quiet. Make sure that you have double protection for sound, so we put ear protectors, plus we put plugs in the ears so that it reduces the decibel noise, the loud MR noise that can damage the baby's ears. Sometimes when you need a quick follow-up for diffusion, sucrose works like magic. In fact, once I've even done a lumbar puncture, just giving them a little sucrose drop in their mouth, and for 1 or 2 minutes they're so happy that they don't move. So sometimes we use that technique. Make sure you have all the safety equipment necessary, all the correct sizes of laryngoscope and endotracheal tubes, and the neonatology nurses are very good at that. The neonatologists work with us and we maintain that equipment in our department. So what coil do we use? Look at the baby's head size will be similar to the difference between the hand size of the adult and the baby. And you know the head size, this is a 17 centimeter field of view. Usually you can even use 10 to 12 centimeter field of view. We have an even smaller coil. And this adult coil is 25 centimeter field of view, so it's much bigger. And mind you, from this formula it tells us the signal to noise ratio is inversely proportional to the coil radius. So the larger your coil radius, the lesser the signal to noise. So you have to use the correct coil size for the baby's head. Another important thing is to optimize sequences. Now these are the images that I showed you in the beginning, but if you look at this image and you did not know the age of the child, you might think that the white matter is abnormal, it is abnormally bright. But this is at 38 weeks, and you can see that this is unmyelinated white matter on T2 images and on T1 images. This is myelinated white matter, completely myelinated at 6 years on T1 and T2. And the only myelination that occurs in the cerebrum at the term age, that is 36 weeks and beyond, is a posterior limb of the internal capsule which is myelinated and seen as a bright stripe on T1 images. So, because there's a lot of water in the brain, the T1 and T2 relaxation times are very long. You can actually use this to your advantage. You can increase your fast spin echo image, you can use fast spin echo images, use your echo trend length, increase it significantly to reduce your time, and it will not cause blurring due to the long T1 and T2 relaxation times. I'm sure those who do MR and MR technologies will understand this technique very well. So just to show you, this is a routine T1 at adult or older child values, and this is a routine T2, the same child at usual normal parameters that you would use. And this is optimized where we have thrown up the TR on both sides, T1 and T2. You can increase the ETL. I could have done that even better with this and decrease the time even more, but you can see how the sharpness increases. The signal to noise ratio increases. So it's very easy to do. If you use the correct coil, you use the correct TR, you'll get beautiful images. Remember that diffusion also is different in the immature brain compared to a mature myelinated white matter. So in preterms, we use a diffusion of 800 milliseconds, whereas in terms, we use the regular average 1000 milliseconds. So you can see this is a preterm child, increased diffusion in the white matter. This is a term child at birth, and this is the DWI trace image, and this is the ADC map. So in terms of technique, you have to make sure that you use the correct sequences in the correct order. The most important sequence for us is diffusion weighted imaging. It gives you the best value for money for time spent, and it just takes 40 seconds. And you can see this is a normal diffusion, and this is restricted diffusion because of a term hypoxic ischemic insult. My preference after that is to do a T1 image. You can even do T2, it is your choice. On T1, look at the plic, that is a posterior limb of the internal capsule, that is normal myelination. And this is abnormal where the increased T1 signal in the ventrolateral thalami and the posterior putamen is a grave sign of very significant hypoxic ischemic injury. Then we do T2 images, and this is normal, and you can see this is abnormal bright signal of the basal ganglia and the thalami because of edema within those structures due to hypoxic ischemic injury. The fourth sequence, which is very important, is gradient echo images. And you could pick up germinal matrix bleed, intraventricular hemorrhages with the gradient echo images. In this particular instance, we see a nice thrombosed vein incidentally seen. This did not have any impact on the child, but you can pick up hemorrhage and blood products within the vessel or outside the vessel using gradient echo images. Just to show you the use of gradient echo images, we saw this susceptibility artifact on gradient echo T2 images in the torcula, and on the MRV we were not sure whether it was an artifact or it was real obstruction. The blooming here suggested that there was an acute thrombus within the torcula, and the CT venography confirmed it. So that's one way of using gradient echo images. This is another way of using gradient echo images where you can pick up the intraventricular hemorrhage, the germinal matrix hemorrhage. This is extending into the parenchyma, so it would be a grade 4 hemorrhage on neonatal ultrasound. This is a follow-up of the same child a few weeks later where the hemorrhage caused hydrocephalus. And on the gradient echo hemorrhage, on the gradient echo T2 images, you can see the hemosiderin lining of the ventricular system. So this child had a drain put in, and because of the high pressures within the ventricular system, you can see the jet of CSF flow causing a pseudo-meningocele in the scalp region of this particular child. Just an interesting finding. The fifth thing that we do is an option. If the child is still quiet and everything is going well, there's nothing wrong with the pulse rate and the breathing and everything else, then we will do MR spectroscopy. And the thing that we want to do for MR spectroscopy is very simply to look at lactate, which is at 1.3 ppm. It is seen as an inverted doublet if you use 144 milliseconds. Now sometimes we will do additional sequences like MR venography, but those are optional. And then of course some people have their own choices and they do different things. But what I'm showing you is a very basic MR technique which works well in more than 95 to 99% of those neonates. So let's look at each sort of sequence protocol and how they help. So T1 weighted images, they are important for normal or abnormal myelination to pick up foci of ischemia. So this is the normal myelination that I showed you here, the posterior limb of the internal capsule at term. These are foci of ischemia, and this is hemorrhage. Now both ischemia and hemorrhage can look bright on T1. The way to differentiate is if you do gradient echo T2 star images, the hemorrhage will bloom, ischemia will not bloom. So that's one way of sort of differentiating the two. I'll come to this sign later. I showed it to you quickly in the sequence of protocols, sequences that you need to do, and I'll discuss it further later. So you should know how myelination progresses in the brain, a very rough guide from center to periphery, from inferior to superior, so the brainstem, white matter myelination before the cerebrum, and from posterior to anterior. So that is the normal sort of myelination pattern in the brain, a very rough general guide. Now these are different appearances of myelination at different ages, 24 to 28 weeks, 26 weeks. What is very important for us is the 37 weeks that is term and beyond the posterior limb of the internal capsule and the perirolandic area, which is slightly bright on T1 images due to myelination. On T2 weighted images, we look for normal anatomy. Remember that in the adult brain, you look for normal anatomy on T1, but in the neonatal brain, you look for normal anatomy on T2. And this is different ages, 25, 29, 33 weeks, and 38 weeks. Look at the appearance of the basal ganglia. It sort of becomes brighter in the thalamus, darker in the thalamus initially, and then becomes more darker anteriorly. So there's a characteristic pattern that you don't need to remember this, but we do about 5 to 10 neonatal MRs every week, and we need to know this because we need to pick up those subtle findings. Then there's also a pattern of how the brain matures and sulcation develops. At 25 weeks, the one thing that you see almost always is the central sulcus. The other thing that you should always look for is the insular sulcus, this one. Because if you don't have the insular sulcus 20 weeks and beyond, you can very safely say that this is a form of lissencephaly or pachygyria, because that is the first sulcus to develop, the insular sulcus. And at 24, 25 weeks, then you'll start seeing the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus. As you go on to 29 weeks, you have other primary sulci which develop. At 33 weeks, it looks like this. And then beyond 33 weeks, the sulci develop fairly rapidly. Just to show you how with increasing age, sulci become deeper, tortuous, and thicker. And by 34 weeks, all the primary sulci have developed and most secondary sulci have developed. So this is 29 weeks, and this is 33 weeks. And you can see by 38 weeks, you have many more sulci. They are much more tortuous. They are much more deeper. Mind you, there's one thing you should remember, that the anteriormost portion of the frontal lobe and the anteriormost portion of the temporal lobe, if you look at these areas, they remain a little flat for a little bit beyond term, and don't mistake that for decreased sulcation. That's a normal finding. One other caveat about MR spectroscopy, the difference between adults or older children and neonates, is that in a normal infant, the NAA is very low. In an older infant beyond 2.5 years, NAA is about 1.5 to 2 times that of choline. So don't mistake that for an abnormality. Also, small amounts of lactate at 1.3 ppm in preterm neoborns is a normal finding often, so don't mistake that for abnormality. So now we come to patterns of injury. It depends on the severity of hypotension, the timing of insult, and the duration of insult. Like I told you, in the preterm, it is more in the periventricular white matter. In the term, it is in the watershed areas and in the gray matter. There's a common spectrum of findings. You'll have germinal matrix bleeds, you'll have T1 bright foci, focal hemorrhages, and you'll have diffusion restriction. So if you have an injury before 34 weeks, usually you get a germinal matrix hemorrhage. 34 to 36 weeks, you have the classic paratrigonal white matter injury, which can lead to periventricular leukomalacia. And then as you go more towards term, it is the deep basal ganglia and the subcortical white matter which can get injured. And at term, you can get perirolandic areas which are injured. So this is a classic sequelae of preterm injury. I'm not showing you the gemal matrix bleed, but this is PVL, loss of white matter along the paratrigonal white matter areas. This is the classic injury at term, and you can see the diffusion restriction in these areas. So the spectrum of preterm insults, as I mentioned again, just to quickly recap, gemal matrix hemorrhage, of course you see this much better with ultrasound, so we don't really do MRs for this. This pattern is becoming more and more common now, where previously it was not well described. These are multiple foci of ischemia. We don't really know what causes this, but we are starting to see it more and more compared to PVL or gemal matrix hemorrhage because of better management of children. The degree of injury is less. And this is, of course, the classic periventricular white matter injury that I already discussed. This is for the residents, this particular slide, because in the American or the Canadian board exams, this is a case that will often be shown. This is sequelae of preterm injury, periventricular white matter injury. So you can see that how the gray matter is coming down and almost touching the ventricular margins. So there's loss of white matter along the ventricular margins posteriorly. You can see that the outline of the ventricle is a little irregular or crenulated. Usually it's very sharp. And sometimes you'll get gliosis around it, and then you get atrophy of the posterior corpus callosum and the splenium because of loss of the white matter tracts due to damage in these areas. So this is classic periventricular leukomalacia, and they're usually present with spastic diplegia. The reason for spastic diplegia, that is weakness in the upper arms more than the lower legs, is because, weakness in the legs it's weakness in the upper limbs more than the lower limbs because the upper limb fibers pass more closer to the ventricular margin than the lower limbs. So that was a pattern of periventricular white matter injury and periventricular leukomalacia. This is a profound hypoxic ischemic injury pattern. Look at the T1 where you've lost the normal plic, and you can see increased signal in the posterior putamen and the ventrolateral thalami. Look at the increased T2 signal in the basal ganglia, and look at the diffusion restriction. These are trace images, and these all turn dark on ADC maps. Now I have put this FLAIR image over here just to point out one thing. Many people all over the world and in Canada and in USA use FLAIR images very routinely in the term child, and it's totally useless. The only thing it is good for if you have an extra-axial, subdural or epidural collection, because this image looks almost normal and you may get a false sense of security. Now remember that FLAIR is fluid attenuation inversion recovery, attenuates free water, so like the CSF and the ventricles. It doesn't attenuate the bound water within the white matter. So it is not of great use to us at this age when white matter is not myelinated. FLAIR becomes important after 2 to 2.5 years of age when the white matter is almost completely myelinated. So that is a very important thing to remember. Just to show you a normal T1 bright stripe, normal myelination, and this is what, before the advent of diffusion, this was a sign we used to use for very profound hypoxic ischemic injury, where the ventrolateral thalami and the posterior putamen became bright on T1 images. Another patient with significant injury to the brain from hypoxic ischemic injury, similar pattern of T1 images. The T2 shows some edema in the thalami. This is the white matter diffusion restriction. And again, FLAIR, which was done just for the sake of demonstration over here, totally useless, does not show us an abnormality. Sometimes it just looks like a T1 image and people mistake it for a T1 image. Now that particular pattern that I just showed you went on to develop multiple cysts within the brain, because that areas of diffusion restriction usually mean that brain does not recover but go on to become gliotic and encephalomalacic. So this is the classic multicystic encephalomalacia. Over time, these cysts sort of get absorbed, and then you're left behind with severe atrophy of the white matter within the brain, and the child is often permanently damaged with a spastic diplegia and other deficits. I thought that there's too much information coming along, so I'll put something funny over here, and let me see if this works. So the question is, what happens in a Canadian police car chase? Let's see if I can open it. That was just to sort of break up the monotonous information that I was passing to you. But that's the situation in Canada right now with lots of snow. And the police never catch anybody. That's true. So I wanted to go on to diffusion, weighted imaging, and restriction in neonates, compare that to adults. Now, if you look at the patterns of cell death or damage that happens to the brain, there are three types that can occur. Acute necrosis, when you have an overwhelming insult. It's like acute infarction or an acute arterial infarction. In that situation, the cell death is almost immediate, and diffusion restriction is almost immediate. So within minutes, you can actually see diffusion restriction. That is well known from the studies done in arterial infarcts in the brain. Then we have delayed necrosis, which is a pattern which often happens in neonates. You have a milder insult, you have reperfusion, some recovery of the mitochondria, then you have secondary energy failure. And this is a pattern which occurs very often in neonates. The first pattern can also occur, which is a very profound insult, but this is more common. And what happens is the diffusion restriction peaks beyond 48 to 72 hours. So if you do a very early scan, you will miss the extent of injury. That's the reason of showing this to you. Another pattern that happens is once there's an insult and there's reperfusion, some of the cells get a signal that they need to die off, so there's delayed apoptosis, which means cell death, which is programmed. And in that case, you don't see any diffusion changes, you don't see any diffusion restriction, you only see volume loss, and that takes time to develop. So this is something we cannot detect with imaging. It's only with follow-up imaging. But this pattern of delayed cell death is very important to remember. So let me show you a case. This was a term newborn with severe asphyxia. We were asked to do a very early scan, less than 1 day, because often they want to withdraw care, because if you allow the child to survive 40 to 72 hours, it sounds very gross, but this is very important for prognosis, then they start breathing on their own, and then they live a damaged life like a vegetable for whatever life that they have left. But if you can withdraw care early enough, and if you can objectively prove that the brain is severely damaged, then they want to counsel the parents and go to the ethics committee and try to withdraw care. So that's why sometimes we do very early brain scans, and you can see this. There's some mild diffusion restriction in the dorsal portion of the midbrain. Now, this wasn't enough to satisfy the parents, and people did not feel comfortable that this was enough diffusion restriction. These are ADC maps confirming the same. So this was on second day, where you can see the diffusion restriction is evolving, it has increased, and by the fourth day, the whole cerebrum is diffusion restricted. And you can see this is the normal cerebellum diffusion, and the rest of the brain is very bright. It's almost like a super scan that you see on the bone scan. So this is like a super diffusion restriction of the cerebrum. So this child unfortunately died, and there was an autopsy performed, and this photographs from my friend, the neuropathologist, Dr. Bill Halliday. And you could see that these areas which were diffusion restrictions show necrosis and gliotic changes. And this is the same MR from that first one that I showed you. You can see the cut sections of the brain show you the cystic areas and encephalomalacia in those areas of the brain. Same things down into the entire brainstem. Just to show you how diffusion can evolve because of the secondary energy failure and delayed cell death that can occur in this particular pattern of hypoxic ischemic injury. So that's very important that you should time your diffusion weighted imaging or your MR after 48. We try to do it within 48 to 72 hours. Sometimes we do it very early for the indication I told you, but routinely we would do it at 48 to 72 hours. If you do it very early, you may miss the extent of damage. When we have such severe diffusion restriction in the brain, sometimes we do coronal diffusion because neonates don't have pneumatized sinuses. It's very easy, there's no artifacts, and we can get very good coronal diffusion weighted images. Now, most of the damage that occurs in hypoxic ischemic injury occurs in the cerebrum. You don't often see a lot of damage in the brainstem and the cerebellum, but make sure you do look at the cerebellum. This is a preterm neonate who, you can see the basal ganglia are totally bright and abnormal. And then there is this small foci of hemorrhage along the folia of the brain, of the cerebellum. Remember that the cerebellum, the germinal matrix is on the surface, and you get hemorrhages on the surface of the brain, and that is a bad prognostic sign because the cerebellum keeps on growing for up to 2 years after postnatal life. So any damage to the cerebrum prevents that growth and can lead to very significant problems, and this baby did not survive. So that was about hypoxic ischemic injury. I just want to go through the differential diagnosis that we have, and I'm going to show you 6 cases. I have enough time, right?
Yeah, you have 10 minutes.
Yeah?
10 minutes.
Okay. So this is the first one that I already showed you, the maple syrup urine disease, and I want the residents and trainees to sort of remember this very well. This involves the posterior fossa, dorsal brainstem, the cerebellar white matter, and the myelinated internal capsule. And this is a very, very characteristic pattern. It's called maple syrup because the urine of these children smells like burnt maple syrup. And this was an encephalopathy which started a few days after birth, which itself is a marker for metabolic disease and not hypoxic ischemic injury. This is another one showing you a very rare metabolic disease process, that is non-ketotic hyperglycemia. I don't expect you to remember this, but just tell you that sometimes MR spectroscopy will help, and in this case there was a glycine peak which helped us clinch the diagnosis. Now don't forget infections, very important also. This was HSV-2 encephalitis. Remember in this one again the encephalopathy occurred 1 day after birth. There's this patchy abnormal areas of T1 and T2 signal and patchy asymmetric areas of diffusion restriction. And this occurs due to exposure to the herpetic lesions during passage through a birth canal. So that helps clinch the diagnosis of HSV-2 encephalitis. Terrible disease. It leaves behind big areas of cystic necrosis in the brain. This is a specific pattern for viruses, enteroviruses, and this is a par echo virus, where you can see tubular sort of diffusion restriction patterns going from deep to the peripheral white matter in the diffusion images. And this has been reported well in literature. This is a case that we contributed to literature for par echo virus encephalitis. Now remember that in neonates you can also get infarction. And this is a large left MCA territory infarct. This child presented with seizures at 24 hours, was otherwise born normally. Usually this could be due to congenital heart disease or sometimes placental thromboembolism or due to thrombotic diseases of the blood. In this pattern, what is very interesting in very young children is you see acute pre-Wallerian degeneration of the corticospinal tract. And you can see that actually the diffusion abnormality in the deep gray and the corticospinal tract and the splenium of the corpus callosum is pre-Wallerian degeneration secondary to the primary MCA infarct. This is a congenital disease which also can present as encephalopathy sometimes, and you may not detect it clinically, but MR can help you. The classic appearance of the zigzag brainstem, the cerebellum is abnormal, and look at the malformation of cortical development, totally flat cortex. So that is Walker-Warburg syndrome. So to conclude, some take-home points. Hypoxic ischemic injury is the commonest cause of encephalopathy in newborns, but consider differentials when the story and findings are unusual. Clinical details absolutely important for you to make the correct interpretation on MR. Think of before the MR, transport, correct technique and coils, and be very familiar with what is normal for the neonatal brain, particularly the immature appearance of the white matter. Bright T2 white matter on T2 images and dark white matter on T1 images. And make sure that you know the exact history, term child versus preterm child, it can be different, and you have to think of all those things in making a diagnosis, because these cases often go on to medico-legal situations where the obstetrician or the neonatologist sometimes is sued and you become an expert witness and you get stuck between two parties. So, and if you want to read more about this, actually we have published this whole lecture is there in a format in radiographics. It's freely available and downloadable if anybody wants to read more on this in detail. Thank you so much.